This week, we're joined by Howie Bacher, lecturer of economics at Towson University and author of Free Our Markets, A Citizen's Guide to Essential Economics. And Howie, you talk about this in your book, and you give several wonderful examples of market solutions to environmental problems. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, the key thing is the incentives in private ownership. The main lesson I like to pass on about markets and the environment is that when people have ownership over natural resources, they both have to be, in their own interest, careful about how they use them, but also because they're the owners and they're responsible, they have to make sure that their use of their resources doesn't bother somebody else. And so private owners, I argue, have a much stronger incentive to look after what they own and make sure that it doesn't harm anybody else than even the best intended politicians and bureaucrats who are managing land that they don't own. The two examples that I use in the book that make this point the best for me, they're the strongest examples I have of it, are on the one hand, the terrible environmental damage in the Tongass National Forest. That's in Alaska. It's the largest national forest, I think. It goes along the coast of Alaska. And for years and years, there was a logging program going on in there run by the Forest Service, which did terrible environmental damage at a gigantic loss. The Forest Service lost 90 cents on every dollar, cutting down old growth forest, spending a tremendous amount of taxpayer money to build logging roads, to build bridges. So there you had real environmental destruction at the taxpayer expense. And the key thing to focus on about this is that the value of the timber that came out of the forest was much less than the cost of building the roads and running the program.
We're at a net loss.
We're at a net loss, about 90 cents on the dollar. And this is run by the Forest Service. The way I ask people to think about it is, well, what are the incentives of the people involved? The Forest Service wants the program because it's budget dollars and new offices and studies to do, contracting to do with the people who build the roads, contracting with the loggers that come in to take the timber. So it's sort of a business for the Forest Service. And if it makes a loss, they don't feel the loss because they just get paid their salaries. Then there's Congress, and Congress benefits from the lobbying dollars of the timber companies in the area who never would cut the logs if it were on land that they owned, if they had to build their own logging roads. So that's an example of what's known in political science as this iron triangle of the bureaucracy, the legislature, and the special interest group. They all have an incentive to keep this program going, even though it's a money loser, it costs the taxpayers, and it's environmentally destructive.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a moment. I would imagine most people, if you ask them what is the Forest Service's incentive, they would say to protect and manage our national forests. Now, you're saying that's not their incentive.
Well, I don't want to say it too strongly, Ant. I'm sure the Forest Service has good people in it, and they would like to preserve and protect the forests. But by legislation, their job is to manage the forests for multiple uses, for logging as well as recreation and so on. I don't know the background politics to it, but I do know that the program went on for decades. The way I like to think of it is, imagine a young person going to work for the Forest Service, and she learns that this program is causing damage at taxpayer expense, and she goes to her superior and says, "Is it true that we lose money on this?" And their superior says, "Yeah, we do." She says, "Well, shouldn't we stop it?" And then her superior says, "Well, and if we do, where are you going to get your next job?" And she sort of shudders, horrified, and goes away mumbling, "Well, maybe we can make it work more efficiently." There are just perverse incentives in the political process, I think, that can override the positive incentives for the good people in the Forest Service who want to look after the forests. They're in a position where it's hard for them to look after the forests because the timber industry wants this subsidy and Congress wants to give it to them.
So you have this example of a national forest, or a forest that's owned by, managed by the government, in which we're actually losing value. It costs us more to pull the trees out than what the trees are worth. Do you have an example in which there's something similar, a forest that's owned and managed privately? And do you get different outcomes?
The other example I use, and again, these are the two strongest examples I can find to illustrate how the incentives are different in the private and the public sector. And that's the story of the Rainey Wildlife Sanctuary in Louisiana. It's owned by the Audubon Society. They're an environmental group. They, for many years, had in the wildlife sanctuary an oil and gas company producing oil and gas. And I asked my students, how did they get in there? How do you suppose the oil company ever got into the wildlife sanctuary? And they think, and some say, well, did the government make them do it? I say, no, there was no coercion in this case. What it turns out is that years ago, an oil company went to them and said, our geologists think there's a fortune in oil and gas down there underneath your birds. Can we come in and drill for oil? You can imagine the environmentalists in the Audubon Society at first saying, are you out of your mind? We hate you guys. But then the oil company says, we will pay you very generous royalties on this oil and gas if you'll let us in. So they did negotiate this, and the oil company was admitted, and there were all kinds of restrictions to protect the birds, to protect the environmental quality of the wildlife sanctuary. The oil company said, look, we can drill at an angle so we can site the rigs in land that doesn't have birds on it and still get to the deposits. They promised to shut down during nesting seasons. They don't do any drilling during nesting season. So they worked it out. And the Audubon Society eventually said, all right, we'll take that deal. And what do you think the Audubon Society did with the royalties?
They bought more land.
They bought and preserved more land.
Yeah.
So it was a win all the way around. And one of the key things here is that the Audubon Society, as the private owner, has an incentive to look after the resource and make sure it's used well and not use it in a way that's going to cause any harm to anybody else. So there's the contrast. The argument I make is that when stuff is publicly owned, the public administrators, the public bureaucrats that manage it don't have any real strong incentive to look after it well. But when resources, land, wildlife are owned privately, there is a strong incentive to manage it well so that it's a continuing source of value.
Howie, I've heard you tell another story a number of times, and when you said you had a couple of examples, I thought for sure you'd be going to the example of the ivory trade and elephants. Is that something maybe you could talk about at least for a second? Because it's been my experience that that story is more shocking than all the other kinds of stories like it.
Sure, James. One difficulty with the story is that part of it is about Zimbabwe, and poor Zimbabwe has been so mismanaged with a terrible dictator that since the period that I studied, a lot has gone on that I can't really bring us up to date on. But the example that I gave was a period of years contrasting what happened to the populations of elephants in Kenya, where the elephants are protected on national parks and no hunting is allowed. Contrast that with Zimbabwe, where both on government game parks and on private land, hunting of elephants was allowed, and at least for a period, the people who took the elephants legally in Zimbabwe could sell the ivory on world markets. To repeat, Kenya, no hunting allowed, government game parks. Zimbabwe, hunting is allowed, often on private land, and the question is, what happened to the populations of the elephants? And our intuitions would tell us that, well, they must have done better in Kenya, where hunting is not allowed, and elephants are protected, than in Zimbabwe, where people are allowed to hunt them. But the opposite was the case, because in Kenya, where they weren't privately owned, nobody really owned them, so nobody had a good, strong incentive to stop the poaching. And people would come in illegally and kill the elephants, and they took down the size of the herds terribly in Kenya. But in Zimbabwe, where private landowners, including some of the villages, were allowed to lease the hunting rights to the wealthy hunters from foreign countries, they had an incentive to make sure that the elephant herds stayed healthy so that they could get the revenue from the hunters year after year. And the villagers who had been afraid of the elephants can cause real damage there. Nevertheless, the villagers would turn in the poachers. Every villager became sort of a game warden because the elephants were valuable to them. The elephants on their territory could be shot by the hunters in a very carefully controlled manner, and they would get revenue and they would get the meat from it and the hides, which were valuable. And so On the privately owned land in Zimbabwe, the elephants thrived, whereas in Kenya, on the publicly owned lands, the elephant herds went down terribly because of rampant poaching.
One of the things that starts to emerge as you tell these stories, Howie, I think for the economic non-experts of the world, and I count myself among them, is that really economics is about incentives. You keep using that word over and over again, I think rightfully so. It's one of the reasons why I love your book so much. You crack it open and it's not filled with charts and graphs, it's filled with stories about incentives. And it is really the economic way of thinking that we're trying to get at here.
Yep, it's about incentives. And it's about the incentives of private ownership. The third chapter of the book zeroes right in on that. The claim is that for human beings to flourish, we need the incentives that come with private ownership, because private owners are going to be careful with their stuff, and they can also be held accountable when they misuse it. So yeah, absolutely. It's about incentives.
But at the same time, it's almost like you're asking people to take a leap of faith, because on the one hand, I can understand a government that spends a bunch of money to hire some people to go after the poachers, to protect the elephants, this kind of thing. What you're asking is that I take this leap of faith and say, well, if we let people own the elephants, the people themselves will protect them. That's harder to get my head around.
Yeah, I understand that. But the free market environmentalists, they've got this slogan that says, if it pays, it stays. There's another case of that in Texas, of all places, that's really painful. I'm not up to date on this because it's years since I finished the book. But while I was working on it, in Texas, there were a number of huge game ranches where the owners of the ranches had brought over exotic African wildlife that was endangered in Africa. And they were thriving in Texas because the ranchers in Texas could get paid big bucks by hunters who wanted to come and kill one of these exotic antelope. And of course, the Texas ranchers did everything they could to make sure the herds were sustainable and healthy, because that would mean revenue year after year. But then well-meaning people put pressure on Congress, said it's terrible for hunters to be killing these animals. They should not be killed. And the last I checked, the rules in Texas had changed, and it was illegal again for people to kill these exotic antelope. And so the ranchers were just letting the herds die out because they couldn't make any revenue from it. It's a tragic thing. Yes, it's counterintuitive. And I understand people who say, look, it's nasty to shoot these lovely animals. I sympathize with that to some degree. But the facts are that people who can make money from hunting of these animals will look after the animals and try to make sure the herds are healthy and sustainable. Oh, there's one other thing on this. In Zimbabwe, another sort of a wrinkle on this. There were a number of government game ranches in Zimbabwe, and government employees, game wardens, were hired to keep the poachers out and protect the animals, including the elephants. But the funding that paid those game wardens came from the fees the government of Zimbabwe got from hunters. And so when the environmentalists stopped the hunting, the revenue flow to the Zimbabwean Park Management Service stopped. They couldn't afford to pay the game wardens so well. And so then that's where Zimbabwe started to lose their herds.
One of the things I think you'll be amused that Ant and I often do when we're speaking in front of a room full of young people and we're not exactly sure they're paying attention or they're not exactly on board with what we're saying, we'll often say something like, you know, if you want to save the spotted owl, get it on the menu at McDonald's.
Yeah, right.
Because we ask rhetorically, how much of a cow shortage are we facing? Because people kill them and eat them all the time, right? Sooner or later, we're going to run out of cows. But of course we don't, because everybody involved in that industry has every interest in maintaining a production line, if you will, of future cows.
Yeah, that's great for getting people to think the species that pay are looked after well. Those that don't aren't. It's regrettable, but that's the way it is.
There's a counter argument here which says, well, yeah, but what you get are these factory farms that treat the animals badly, and all you've done is produced massive misery amongst these cows or pigs or whatever it is. But again, you get the market coming to the rescue. Because if people are concerned about that, you get what I've noticed on the news recently of people who are concerned with this sort of thing, making it public and saying, here are the farms, the producers that treat their animals badly. And people who are concerned about this stop buying from them.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm very sympathetic to that. I don't know much about it, but I've heard some stories about the factory farms with chickens in particular that upset me. I'd be willing to pay more for chickens that were raised in a humane way. So I appreciate the effort that people make to bring this to the public's attention and for people's willingness to spend a little bit more for chickens that have been raised in a humane manner.
I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear you say what you just said, but I'll reiterate it. I couldn't agree more. And I think when we look at the movement towards humane farming of animals, you do see a big move in the market that supports this sort of thing. So when you really think it through, there's a lot of upside on the other side of the street here that people tend not to think about.
And we might want to throw in here that it's only a pretty wealthy society that can afford to just pay more for their food.
Right.
And so we want the benefits of a healthy, dynamic economy to make people wealthy enough so that they say, I'm not going to eat chicken that hasn't been raised in a humane manner. I want it free range. Well, it's real expensive.
We've spent the time talking about the differences between what happens when the government owns resources versus private individuals owning the resources. I want to turn our attention a little bit. Let's say I buy the stories that you're saying that we get better outcomes when resources are owned privately because the incentives are there to husband the resources. However, perhaps there's a role now for government. If resources are going to be owned privately, the government should regulate how these things are used, what's produced, the quality of what's produced, this sort of thing. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on government regulation of privately produced products.
This is something that I continue to work on. I've got an article coming out soon on it. I believe that, at least with respect to safety and quality, market forces regulate better than government agencies can. Let me start with a modern example that I think most people will respond to. Who do you think regulates the quality of your ride services better? The local taxi commission or Uber and Lyft? Who's going to make sure that the driver is really qualified and the car is in good shape? Who's more likely really to do that? When you think about it, with Uber and Lyft, every damn rider is an inspector. Every rider puts in a rating. That's a very robust system for rating quality and safety. It's got to be better than what the government can do. And with that in mind, I find myself thinking that the public service commissions, the taxi commissions of our country are simply totally obsolete now. They could all just be abandoned and there would be no difficulty because people would use the rating techniques that Uber and Lyft and all have given us, and we would have high quality regulation of quality and safety.
A taxi ride or an Uber ride is one thing, but what about things where your life is quite literally on the line, like pharmaceuticals?
That's a good example. Let me be clear for your listeners. I think it's very important that we have excellent regulation of the quality and safety of our medicines. That's fundamental. We definitely want that. But partly because I think that such regulation is so important, and it's so important that it be high quality, I think it should be done by market forces rather than the FDA. Again, the Food and Drug Administration doesn't have the kind of incentives they need, I believe, to regulate in a manner that takes everything into account. There's a lot that can be said on this, but maybe the simplest and most important part of it is that the FDA could make two kinds of mistakes. They could let a bad drug go through onto the market, or they could make the mistake of keeping a good drug off the market. Well, again, think of incentives. What is their incentive? If they let a bad drug go onto the market, what are the consequences for the people in the FDA? Well, they're quite severe. The victims are going to be on the cover of People magazine. They're going to be congressional inquiries and committee meetings. It's going to be a big hassle for them. So these good people in the Food and Drug Administration do not want to let a dangerous drug get out onto the market. Well, in accordance with that incentive, they are very, very careful. They do lots and lots of tests before letting a drug get out onto the market. But the consequence of that is they delay from the market many drugs that could really help people. And in some cases, probably keep drugs off the market entirely that could help people. The research on this suggests that the harm from keeping the good drugs off the market is much greater than the harm that they are preventing with their careful regulation. So there again, it's a matter of incentives. And I don't say anything negative about the people in the FDA. I'm sure they're good people doing the best they can. But following their incentives, they err too much on the side of caution, and that causes human suffering by making drugs more expensive, by blocking them from the market.
All right, but I can point to people who have died because of faulty drugs. The 70s, we had all the thalidomide babies, these sorts of things. How do you point to people who would have lived but didn't had a drug been released?
I don't know that we can point to them. We can't see them.
So then how do we know that the FDA is doing more harm by withholding beneficial drugs than it is by keeping bad drugs off the market?
I don't know that we know for certain, Ann, but there's a lot of sound economics research suggesting that that is the case. One of my sources on this is a great website called fdareview.org, which goes over the science on this. I can't give you proof, Anthony, but the weight of the evidence seems to be that the FDA does a lot more harm than good. Thrombolytic therapy that dissolves blood clots was kept off the market for 2 years, and an estimated 22,000 deaths resulted. Now, as I understand that, where that number comes from is that when the FDA passes a drug, they say, okay, this is a good drug, we're going to let it be marketed. It should save, say, 11,000 lives a year. Well, if it saves 11,000 lives a year and it's kept off the market for 2 years, that means that 22,000 lives might have been lost that could have been saved. Similarly, interleukin-2, which treats kidney cancer, was kept off for 3.5 years. An estimated 3,500 deaths resulted. Misoprostol prevents bleeding ulcers, kept off for 9.5 months, and 8,000 to 15,000 deaths may have resulted, and so on. There's a lot of study, a lot of research of that kind that is persuasive to me, at least. I'm not saying it's proof, but it's persuasive.
I think you frame that exactly correctly. I don't think we're ever going to find proof, right? There's just the weight of the argument that you can examine, the giving of reasons, right, when we think about what we should do next. And this brings us, I think, headlong into something that Ant and I butt up against quite often when we think about the regulatory state, which really defines our political lives one way or the next, our private and social lives too, for that matter. When you look at the regulatory state, what you really see is an apparatus designed to take the risk, or at least the perception of risk, out of everyday life. When you start thinking about maybe deregulating or leaving things as they evolve over time, you're left with the observation that life is actually quite dangerous, and wouldn't it be better if we could make it less so? And that's a very compelling argument. Meanwhile, a constant state of affairs where there is some risk and danger involved, not nearly as compelling. So how do you start making these arguments in public in a way that don't get you laughed out of the room?
The next part of this, I think I've developed it since I wrote the book. That is thinking about how market forces regulate. And James, I would say, I think it's a bad idea for people like the three of us and others who are lovers of liberty to say we should deregulate. Because what people hear there is that we're not going to have any regulation. But we all want the quality of the medicines we take to be regulated. We want the drivers of our Lyft services to be regulated. We want to know that they're competent and peace-loving and so on. So we want regulation. But regulation doesn't have to be done by the government. And let's take pharmaceuticals for just a quick sketch of how markets regulate the quality of them. Think of all the players in a market for drugs that want to make sure the drugs are safe and effective. First of all, if it's a drug company that sells stock on the stock exchanges and wants to be around for a while, they care about their reputation. They don't want to get sued. So they want to be careful. Those pharmaceutical companies have insurance companies they buy insurance from, and their insurance companies don't want them to get sued. The doctors that prescribe drugs want to make sure that the drugs are going to be effective for their patients. Similarly with hospitals, similarly with the drug stores that would sell the drugs. All of these players in the market want to know, is this drug safe? Is it effective? Completely apart from the mandatory research that the FDA requires, doctors are doing research all the time about the effectiveness of different drugs. So there's a great wealth of information being generated in the private sector that hospitals, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, drugstores all want to use to make sure that their patients get good results. And so I think that the market forces regulate the quality of medicines in that way. Every player, or almost every player in the process, has an incentive to make sure that the drugs are safe and effective. Now, of course, it's possible that some pharmaceutical company just wants to make a killing on some drug they haven't tested properly. But the doctors that are prescribing that want to be careful. The drugstores want to be careful about it. The hospitals might say to the doctors, look, you can't prescribe that drug until it's been tested properly, until we get more research from the Mayo Clinic and from Duke University Hospital and so on, all these people who work on examining the effectiveness and the safety of different pharmaceuticals. So I've more and more started to become persuaded or persuade myself that robust forces of self-interest in the market are going to lead people to put high quality, safe products on the market. Not perfectly, but it's probably going to be better than the assurances that government bureaucrats give us.